The Gravedigger by the Prowler. To say that the life of the common citizen who called the streets of Liverpool home during the mid-19th century difficult would be an understatement. The lack of opportunities regarding earning a living, to the filth on the streets, the smell of freshly strewn chamber pots permeating the alleyways and main thoroughfares of the city almost made it difficult to breathe. While the noble classes wined and dined without a care, the ordinary commoner had to get creative to earn a shilling. While yes, there were citizens who enjoyed respectful occupations, such as the common shop owner, bakers, butchers, delivery men, and the like. Other less unfortunates had to get a little more creative. Some turned to thievery, others provided enjoyment and companionship to a gentleman for the right price. And then there's the special individual who made their living by scouring the graveyards and cemeteries. There were two different types of grave robbers during the time. One that would dig up corpses and sell them to the universities and medical schools for anatomy and medical knowledge purposes. And then there were the ones that just dug up the freshly deceased to rob them of their valuables. One particular coffin disturber, a Mr. Reginald Wrigglesbottom, was making quite a name for himself in the hushed corners and dark alleyways of society. An orphan in his youth, he turned to petty crimes once he hit the streets when he became of age. After a year or two of pickpocketing and common thievery, he latched on to an older gentleman who taught him a trade, and after that he spent his nights toiling the graveyard soil for plunder and financial gain. He became known to local law enforcement and had to spend a night or two in the jails, but for the most part, he was successful at his craft. Night after night, he took to the graveyards, his streak only coming to a temporary halt when he was brought in by Scotland Yard for questioning in the Prowler slayings. But they quickly deduced he hadn't the skills to perpetrate such crimes and let him go. He developed a reputation of being the best grave robber in the business, always seeming to find large scores every night. And when he wasn't just stealing the valuables from the deceased, he was also known to be quite dependable at procuring the proper bodily specimen for the medical students and university doctors who came calling. He did have a problem, however. He had a habit of spending his money almost as quickly as he dug it up, and he was running out of funds. He thought his last score would have set himself up comfortably for at least a few months. He had taken quite the stash of valuables off the corpse of Lady Jane Wetzel, a socialite who recently met her untimely demise, but it couldn't even last him a month. He wasn't worried, however, for he already had a lead on a promising grave. A young countess died unexpectedly, and she was scheduled to be buried this afternoon. Countess Philomena Postlethwaite. She belonged to one of the most wealthiest and powerful families in all of England. There must be a treasure trove buried alongside her, he thought. He went to the cemetery around 3 in the afternoon and waited. He wasn't there long when they ushered the Countess's corpse to what was to be her final resting place. He stood there and watched from a distance, behind an old mausoleum, as her parents watched and wept as they shoveled the dirt atop her coffin. It was rumored she was buried with her favorite ruby necklace her father gave her for her 18th birthday. Tonight, he would find out if those rumors were true. After she was buried, He went back home to prepare for his return later in the evening. He put together a bag of proper supplies he needed for his grave-robbing excursions. Tools of the trade, if you will, to ensure the swiftest and smoothest of outcomes. A shovel to break through the earth, a pickaxe and crowbar to pry open the stingiest of coffins, and finally a hatchet and butcher knife to do away with any stiff limbs that prevent the taking of valuables. He had made that mistake early on in his career with old Mrs. Wilkinson. He dug her up, broke into her coffin with ease, but spent over an hour trying to pry loose valuable gold rings from her fingers that had frozen clutched from rigor mortis. Never again has he made that mistake. Now, whenever he sees a corpse's balled-up fist, he cuts first. There's no time for questions. He waited for the grandfather clock to strike the midnight hour, and he was on his way. He moved through the foggy night, making sure not to be seen by the scant life that was out on the street at such an ungodly hour. He nestled himself inside the alleyways until he reached the Archway Cemetery, a resting ground for some of England's most wealthiest of families. If this were to go quickly, he might see if there was anything else worth breaking into, he thought. He waited for the night watchman, which was a joke, by the way, an 85-year-old man with a dog that matched, who should be in a home for the old, gumming his porridge instead of protecting this place. However it is, what it is. And as I was saying, he waited for the geriatric night watchman to pass, and he snuck in behind him. He then moved his way through the headstones, making his way to the young countess's freshly packed grave, and got to work. He shoveled his way through the freshly loose soil with ease, then cracked open the expensive casket. He stood and stared, mesmerized by the glow of the rumored ruby necklace that shined from the moon above. He hastily dropped the shovel and pickaxe to the ground, leaving them as they lay, and pulled out his knife. This has been so easy. If I hurry, I'll be able to break into a few more graves, he thought. He then proceeded to remove the ruby necklace from around her neck, then noticed an assortment of gold rings that adorned fingers on both hands, glistening in the moonlight. Both hands were clenched, so he took his trusty knife and began to sever her fingers. Once he removed two of the fingers with rings on them, he stopped and admired them, but only for an instant. Just then, a blood-curdling scream rang out from the coffin below his feet. The Countess! She was not dead. The removal of her fingers must have jolted her from her medical slumber. Reginald did not know this, however. He thought she was a ghost, or some vengeful demonic entity, angry for the thievery of her jewelry. She was pale and bloody, her eyes wide and ghostly white. She looked at Reginald and shrieked, "Who are you?" He dropped the bloody fingers in fright, still gripping his knife tightly in his hand. He stepped back a few paces as he stood up, moaning in pain. He stood there trembling in fear as she looked into his eyes, half masked in a silhouette from the moonlight, inside the ditch of the grave. He screamed out, "Please don't hurt me! Take back your necklace!" Her body then flinched, and when it did, he screamed and quickly turned, trying to crawl out of the grave. But in his fright and confusion, he didn't realize the wall of soil was right behind him, and when he turned hurriedly, he hit the wall of dirt hard, plunging the knife that was tightly gripped in his hand and positioned ever so into his inner groin. He stood there facing the mound of soil, stunned. quickly feeling the pain overtake his entire body as he felt the blood begin to pour out of his angry wound. The Countess, who was in a state of shock, managed to make her way out of the grave and walked off into the night, safely returning to her family. Reginald stood, still inside the grave, staring up at the moon, becoming lightheaded from the blood loss. Still in a state of terror, he reached up and grabbed hold of a root that was sticking out of the soil and tried to pull himself up out of the grave. His grip was weak, but he was trying. Just as it seemed he would climb his way out and reach the top, the root snapped, sending him falling atop his pickaxe that was laying point side up. As the once thought dead Countess walked to safety in the cold, foggy night, the once lively grave robber lay dying, bleeding out inside her grave. The Countess was never truly dead. She didn't return as a ghost or vengeful ghoul like Reginald thought. It was just a common occurrence during the time of a mistaken death and burial. The Countess was sick and slipped into a temporary coma. Her family mistakenly thought she was dead and buried her quickly, and with autopsies not common during the time, there was no way of knowing that she was still with the living. Since this kind of thing had happened before, some families had resorted to planting bells atop the graveside with a string that was tied to the person who was believed to be dead below. And if they should wake up buried, they could ring the bell and be rescued. In this case, however, the Countess's family was assured by a renowned doctor that she was absolutely dead, and there was no need for a bell. The Missing Platoon by the Prowler. It's the summer of 1944, France. It's been a week since the Allies have successfully stormed and held on to the beaches of Normandy. As each day goes by, the Allied forces are bogged down in certain areas in their advance, while making gains in other parts of the region. In the areas where they have advanced, nightly patrols are conducted to maintain the integrity of their lines, as well as special forces operations to disrupt the German counter-offensive. Which brings us to the story of a private first class, James Joseph Rush, the lone surviving member of a small platoon tasked with scouting the French countryside for any German movement on the night of June 14th. James' story is frightening, however, and not because of the typical horrors of war, but because of the mystery and unbelief of his story. The disappearance of the rest of his platoon, and the bloody, chilling reason as to why they disappeared. The night's excursion started out as any other. No surprises, just simple routine. This was not the first time Private James and his platoon, which was led by a Lieutenant, Ronald Sickles, had been out scouting for the enemy. After about an hour out, they came across what they thought to be an abandoned chateau. It was partially bombed out, but you could tell before the war that this was a most lavish mansion, probably belonging to the most wealthy family in the region. It had a small family cemetery that was nestled in the back of the manor grounds, separated by an unkept, decaying garden. Also, this was at one time a working farm, as evidenced by the crumbling barn and stables towards the back end of the property, just beyond the cemetery, also showing signs of being touched by the war. The platoon had not come across the property before on their nightly rounds, and hadn't heard mention of it from any other platoons either, so they quickly took note of its location on the map to report of its whereabouts to their superiors when they returned back to base. As they were heading out, however, a Corporal Fabio Manelli spotted a faint glow from a candle in the attic window. He quickly informed Lieutenant Sickles of what he saw, and they drew up a plan to enter the old chateau. There had been reports and rumors of German movement in the area, of small squads trying to get a foothold for an upcoming larger attack in the coming days, and they thought this could be one of those German squads trying to entrench themselves in the old, dilapidated manor. During his interview with officers from his regiment, Private Rush said this was the moment he and the other members in his platoon were the most nervous, the calm before the storm, if you will. They entered slowly and as quietly as they could through the front door of the old chateau, but as they did, they were immediately hit with a horrible rotting stench that as Private Rush could only describe as the smell of death, saying in his interview that he had grown accustomed to the smell and knew it instantly from being constantly surrounded by it during his time in Normandy up to that point. He then said they cautiously moved deeper into the decaying home, but as they traveled further, it became darker and darker. Lieutenant Sickles ordered a Private Johnson to strike a match as they continued with only the faint light of a matchstick lighting their path. From what they could see, the inside of the chateau was in decent shape. While dusty, it almost had a lived-in quality about it. There were still fine paintings that adorned the walls, and expensive-looking candelabras and other fine trinkets that filled the shelves. Such fine items you would think would have been taken with the owners as they fled the invasion. As they moved upstairs, the smell of death became stronger. A few members of the platoon had to stifle their disgust and urge to vomit, so they wouldn't give up their location and their element of surprise to the unsuspecting Germans. The march up the stairs was nerve-wracking and eerily quiet. Only a hollow wind from outside the bombed-out chateau could be heard as it made its way inside, echoing through the damage made from past shelling to the home, and constantly snuffing out the light from the match that lit their way. As they reached the top of the landing, they tried to scan the second floor as best they could. To their left was a banister overlooking the bottom floor hallway, and to their right was a wall lined with a row of rooms that eventually curved to a half circle down another hallway they could not see yet. The platoon quickly and quietly searched each room and found no signs of the Germans, but once again found signs of life in each room, recent life, as though someone was still living there. After systematically taking apart the second floor, the platoon filed tightly back into the hallway that led to a final door, which then led into the attic. They moved slowly down the hall, trying ever so quietly not to make a sound as they stepped on the aging floorboards, trying to avoid any loud cracking sounds that could alert the enemy. As they got closer to the door which led up to the attic, a rich smell of copper permeated the air. Being on the front lines for as long as they had, the platoon knew that smell could only mean one thing: blood, and lots of it. Maybe the Germans were dealing with some wounds, they thought, which would be beneficial to our ambush. Those thoughts were only strengthened as the platoon heard faint moans as they reached the door. Lieutenant Sickles was the first through the door, and when he opened it, the platoon was greeted by the stench of death. What the frightened Private Rush could only describe as to like walking into a slaughterhouse. The lieutenant looked up the small set of stairs and could see the illumination of candles lighting the attic. The stairs were narrow, so only 2 men at a time could go up, hampering a full ambush. The lieutenant sent up Corporal Manelli and Private Johnson first to get a foothold inside the attic and keep the Germans in place while the rest of the platoon filled up the stairs. He told them right when they reached the 6th step to start screaming, like 100 men were coming up the steps. There was no need for the element of surprise at this point. Plus, it might freeze the Germans in place, especially if there are injuries. The two got into position, and Lieutenant Sickles sent them up. They quietly moved up the first couple steps. Then by the 6th step, they started to scream and rushed up the remaining steps into the attic entrance. They stood their ground and barked orders not to move. But then abrupt silence. The rest of the platoon could see the 2 men standing at the top of the stairs, seeming to tremble. Lieutenant Sickles led the rest of the platoon quickly up the stairs, but noticed the room becoming darker. Someone was blowing out the candles. Lieutenant Sickles barked at the platoon to move double time before they lost visibility. But right before he reached the top of the stairs, Corporal Manelli turned around and screamed, "They're eating everybody! Hurry, Lieutenant!" Then he was pulled violently into the darkness, along with Private Johnson. The lieutenant and the rest of the platoon filled into the attic, staring into the darkness, for all of the candles were now snuffed out. Private Rush, during his interview, described an immense feeling of fear and panic that set in at that point with him and the rest of his platoon. He followed with something truly frightening. As they stood in the darkened attic, they could hear what sounded like chewing into wet meat, sounds of tearing and ripping into moist flesh. The lieutenant began screaming to show yourselves. Whoever's hiding in the dark, make yourselves be known and surrender. There was no answer. All that could be heard was the hollow wind from outside blowing into the cracks and openings in the attic walls, followed by gargling and more ripping into flesh. The lieutenant then turned to the rest of the platoon and frantically asked for light. "Strike a match or something. We need to see what's in the dark." But Private Johnson had the matches, and he was pulled into the darkness. Just then, however, even in his frightened state, Lieutenant Sickles smartly ordered Private Rush to open a loosely boarded-up window on the other side of the attic. He quickly did, and when he busted open the window, the light from the full moon came pouring in, lighting the entirety of the spacious attic. What greeted them in the moonlight, however, chilled their blood cold and left many frozen in their place with an unshakable state of fear, including Private Rush. Before them sat the inhabitants of the house, feasting on the corpses of Corporal Manelli and Private Johnson, surrounded by the partially digested corpses of the rumored German squad they had been searching for. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, maybe husband and wife, maybe brother and sister. Whatever the case, they were ravenously ripping into the flesh of their prey, behaving like predatory beasts, not human whatsoever, covered in ghostly shrouds. The platoon looked on in horror until the lieutenant mustered up the courage to scream, "Fire!" Once he did, the man and woman instantly looked up and growled at the men, letting out blood-curdling shrieks of anger. The platoon opened up a heavy fire into the corner of the room the man and woman were in. But like some demonic, ghostly apparition, the 2 moved quickly and swiftly, dodging the bullets, and made their way out of the open window and were spotted heading into the cemetery. During this time of the interview, Private Rush became most upset. He recalls a plan by Lieutenant Sickles to go into the cemetery and finish off the man and woman, or whatever they were. The lieutenant ordered Private Rush to stay put in the attic and tend to the wounded, if any, and if possible to search for any intel within the attic. The rest of the platoon gathered all the ammo they could and headed out toward the cemetery. Private Rush watched from the window as his comrades entered the cemetery. It appeared they were following a trail, possibly blood. There was no way we couldn't have hit them with the amount of shots we poured into that attic corner, he frighteningly exclaimed. He watched as his platoon followed the trail into a large marbled crypt. He watched them file inside one by one, then patiently waited. Minutes went by, but there was nothing, no sound, no word of an all clear from the rest of the platoon. Just silence, eerie silence. That was quickly ended, however, with the sounds of his platoon opening fire. Loud shots rung out into the eerie night, followed by gut-wrenching screaming. Cries of help could be heard. Private Rush swears he heard the lieutenant screaming for him to get out of the house and run and get help. Whether that was true or not, the private quickly fled the property. The final sounds being heard were that of loud, ravenous snarls and growls, ending with a high-pitched shriek. That was the moment Private Rush said he feared the most for his life. So close to escape, but not knowing how close the man and woman were, if they were following at all. Private Rush was doing his best throughout the interview to keep his composure. Finally broke towards the end, and the officers could not get any more from him. The story was quite hard to believe by the officers who interviewed him. A man and woman killing 2 platoons worth of men and feasting on their corpses, also being described as looking as a normal man and woman, but acting ravenous and animalistic. Sure, they could be feral and hungry, being isolated and cut off from the rest of the world due to the war that surrounded them. But how do you explain the ghostly shrouds and moving around like a demonic apparition? Private Rush never spoke of the incident ever again, or at all for that matter. His report and interview was described as a soldier who simply buckled under the pressures of war and simply snapped. Just a case of shell shock, and the incident was swept under the rug. There was still members of a missing platoon to investigate, however, that could not simply be swept under a rug. A search party was sent, following the directions given by Private Rush, and they found the decaying chateau. No members of the missing platoon were found, not in the attic or in the crypt in the cemetery, not even the bodies of the German platoon. However, before you claim doubt on Private Rush's story, what was found was quite disturbing. The attic and cemetery grounds were saturated in blood, and the attic was strewn with German and American equipment, along with hundreds of spent shell casings littering the floor. Something happened here. It looked like a bloodbath, a few members of the search party described. Many believe Private Rush's story to be a lie, or at least too hard to be believed. Some do believe his story to be true. Whatever you believe, there is one thing that is for certain. No other member of his platoon was ever seen or heard from again. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.